Hi, I'm Jim Doti, and welcome to Dialogue. Christine, I'm really excited about this show. We have one of my heroes, political heroes, with us, and so proud and privileged that we could have you at Chapman University. I'm speaking of Senator George McGovern, who's perhaps best known as the candidate who ran against Richard Nixon in 1972. What's probably not as well known is that Senator McGovern was a flying ace during World War II. Bomber pilot, 35 missions, received the Distinguished Flying Award, then became a representative and senator in South Dakota, generally a Republican state. And,
still is.
And Senator, you became your first year elected was 1962. What was that like?
Well, that was my first election to the Senate. I went there on the margin of 597 votes.
Oh, my goodness.
We had a recount, and South Dakota didn't have many voting machines, so we had to examine every one of those paper ballots in 67 counties. Finally, a month after the election, I was declared the winner. That same year, Ted Kennedy went to the Senate, and he became my seatmate. We sat right next to each other in the back row for years. In the Senate, if you get a little seniority, you're entitled to move up. Eventually, you might end up in the front row. Ted and I stayed in the back row. We opted to do that. Also, Gaylord Nelson, Wisconsin. I said to Gaylord one day, you know, the only problem was staying back here in the back row. Sometimes you can't hear the debate on the Senate floor. He says, that's what makes it the best seat in the House.
You didn't have Twitter back then, so you couldn't be twittering, but what did you and the senator talk about back there together a large part of the time?
I was always curious about his family. What was Jack really like?
Yes.
What was Bobby really like? Tell me about your mother and father, what they were really all about. So I had to pull him pretty hard to get that personal information, but I did get some insights on the family. One thing that Joe Sr., Ted's father, told all of the boys and the girls, never hire somebody except somebody that's smarter than you. Always try to hire people to work for you.
I'd say that's a very good
that know
advice.
more than you do. He said in that way you broaden your own knowledge. And I remembered that. He told me a number of stories, but that's one that I've remembered.
Senator McGovern, something I remember very, very well. And I don't think many people had this experience because you accepted your acceptance address at the 1972 Democratic Convention was delivered at something like 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm a student of, I love to hear great speeches of Churchill, of FDR, of Adlai Stevenson, and John F. Kennedy. And I really believe one of the great speeches of all time was that acceptance address. You were one of the first senators to come out against the Vietnam War. You're known as a courageous political figure taking on unpopular causes. That became a much more popular, more accepted position later. But you were one of the first to come out against it. And I'll never forget hearing your ringing words, "Come home, America, come home, America," as you presented that address. Tell us about that. Were you disappointed? Why was it that it was so late in the evening when nobody was up to hear one of the great speeches, I think, of all time?
Well, obviously, we flubbed it by letting the convention run on and on until it's, as you said, 2:30 in the morning. I think I finished speaking at 3:15. I believe my mother saw and heard that speech, maybe my wife and you, but the great body of Americans were asleep. And that was a tragedy, a political tragedy, because I was a comparatively new face in politics. I was running against experienced candidates for the nomination. Hubert Humphrey, very talented, articulate man. Ed Muskie, Mayor John Lindsay of New York, Governor Sanford of North Carolina, 15 other candidates. And so in order to win that nomination, you had to scratch and claw and stay up all night and travel. And the country never saw an awful lot of that byplay. And here was my opportunity for 75 or 80 million Americans to hear me speak calmly at prime time. And we let the time run out with the business of the convention. And so I was finally put on at an ungodly hour. I think it was a little later than 2:30 in the morning, and that cost us heavily. I think if I had given that speech, President Doti, at, let's say, 9 o'clock in the evening, when we had maybe 80 million Americans, I think we might have survived some of the other bumps in the road that we had later on.
There's a wonderful documentary that's been produced. I recommend it to all the viewers, and you can easily see it free
on Netflix. Yes.
On Netflix. Just go netflix.com and pull up one shining moment, and it was a bright shining moment. And in there, the statement, somebody says, just think if George McGovern were elected president, there would have been no Watergate. I mean, history would have been completely different.
Yes.
Yeah.
I went to Nixon's funeral, as I did Mrs. Nixon's funeral earlier. I don't have any malice towards Nixon. I wanted to defeat him, of course, but I was listening to the eulogies about President Nixon, which were fine, but the thought went through my head that even from his standpoint, he'd have been better off if I had won in '72. He wouldn't have been thrown out of office in disgrace a few months after the election. We wouldn't have had the Watergate trauma, and he'd have just been better off. It would have been hard to convince him of that on election night.
Yes,
but
so
I think it's true.
Did your pick of Eagleton destroy all that? Was that the sole reason?
It hurt us because of the confusion over that selection. I wish that Tom had told us when we asked him.
Just so our viewing audience knows that history is that when you selected Thomas Eagleton, who later announced that, or it was uncovered that he had mental illness, and he had to resign his position or pull out of the election.
He apparently had had some 14 or 15 years of treatment for
depression, wasn't it?
Clinical depression.
Yes.
I wish he had told us.
Would people be more accepting of that today if
they
came out front?
I think so. I think we know more about it.
Yes.
We have better medicines.
It can be treated, yes.
It can be treated. But the first thing that a presidential nominee does that the public sees is to pick his running mate.
Yes.
So it didn't help us.
Not a good way to begin.
Not a good way to begin.
The election.
I frankly don't know what was the best thing to do after we had picked Senator Eagleton and this history of mental problems came out. I do know that that's all the press wanted to talk about was his.
Yes, of course.
And I felt finally that it was going to divert attention from all the other issues, so I asked the senator to step down. I'm frankly not sure that was the right thing to do. Perhaps we should have stayed with him, because the problem with that is that I not only had a candidate with a history of mental instability, but I changed my mind.
Right.
So where's McGovern at? Is he for his vice presidential pick, or is he against it? So we got hit with the indecisiveness.
I think you summed it up when you said you were going to be damned if you do and damned if you don't.
I
It was
think
one
that's
of those
right.
things.
That's what
And
Dr.
yes.
Menninger, the great psychiatrist in Topeka, Kansas, told me. He said, no matter which way you go,
Yes.
you're going to be hurt. So I said, well, I guess, doctor, what you're telling me, I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. He said, that's the way I see it. I went back to my room out in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and I have to tell you, I just wept after that conversation with Dr. We had worked so hard
Yes.
to win that nomination. Keep in mind, 16 people running for the nomination, and so we were triumphant. And then to have it threatened by a single factor like the mental state of my running mate, it just, it was more than I could bear to think about it.
Well, choosing our running mates and our mates in life, I guess, is a very,
Very
important task.
Very
Yeah,
important
yeah.
task. Speaking of, I know your wife passed away,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
You had a long, wonderful marriage and 5 children.
I really
5
did.
children.
I had Eleanor as my wife for 63 years.
Oh my gosh.
Now, that's a long time.
That is.
But I enjoyed every minute in her presence. Well, that's not quite right. Every marriage,
Well, we
every
get it.
Not
marriage
every
has
minute.
a few,
No.
you know,
understand.
a few tensions and so on. But I always felt I was very lucky to have this beautiful, lovely woman as my wife, and she helped immeasurably in the campaign.
Yes. Yes.
Speaking of campaigns, there's another campaign, a lifelong campaign of yours, starting with, I believe President Kennedy appointed you to Food for Peace,
Yeah.
but then President Clinton also made an appointment, and you still hold a position as an ambassador
Yeah.
for food. And tell us about your mission there and your goal.
Well, this hunger issue has been my passion. Most people associate me with the effort to end the war in Vietnam, and that's fine, because that war did become an obsession with me. I thought it was such a dreadful mistake. But always the problems of hunger in the world would recur. I think it began with World War II. I was a bomber pilot in Italy, and as our ship came into Naples Harbor to land and to send us into flying combat missions, we noticed along the docking area in Naples Harbor hundreds of little children, just little tads, and they were yelling at us. As you got a little closer on the boat, you could hear some broken English that, "Hey, Joe's, Babe Bruce, Butterfingers, Hershey bars." You know, at that point, the captain of the ship broke in and said, "Do not throw anything to those children. This is war-torn Italy. Those children are at the edge of starvation." Yesterday, an American troop ship came in here, and they started throwing things to the children. Some of it fell in the water, and 25 of those little tads drowned, scrapping for bits of food. Italy's now probably the best fed country in the world. You got to work
That's for
hard
sure.
to find a bad restaurant in
That's right.
Italy.
Exactly.
Not so in World War II.
Right.
But I made up my mind then, if I ever got a chance to fight human hunger, I was going to do that. I teamed up in the Senate in the 1960s and 70s with Bob Dole, Republican from Kansas. He was he and I didn't agree on a lot of things, but we agreed on that. And we tripled the size of the school lunch program in the United States. We doubled the food stamp program. We started a new program called WIC, Women, Infants, Children, which provided nutritional supplements for low-income nursing and pregnant women and their infants through the age of 5. All of a sudden, years later, I find myself back in Italy as ambassador to the 2 big UN agencies there that deal with world hunger, President Clinton had appointed me, and I looked at the problems of global hunger in that period, just as I had under President Kennedy when I headed the Food for Peace program. And I discovered there are 300 million school-age kids that get nothing to eat in many of these developing countries during the school day. And I came up with an idea that the United Nations, with the United States in the lead, should set a target of providing a good, nutritious meal every day for every hungry school kid in the world. And again, I persuaded my Republican friend Bob Dole to team up with me. So now we have a program called the McGovern-Dole program to feed the children, and it's moving along. We're now reaching about 22 million kids every day through the United Nations and other agencies, but that means we've got a long ways to go. So I have to live long enough to make sure we get to all these kids before I say goodbye.
Absolutely. Great cause. I see Jim has pulled up a book
Yeah,
that you've written.
many people don't realize that the senator is also a recipient of a PhD at Northwestern University in American history, taught at colleges and universities, and continues to lecture, recipient of many honorary degrees, but is also an author. I think you've written 3 or 4 or 5 books.
Now,
Your most recent being
why one more on
Abraham Lincoln, which both of us read.
Yes.
And you know, this, you hear the cliche, hard to put down.
Yes,
We
didn't put it down.
You couldn't put it down.
You didn't.
And it's probably the shortest book I've read on Lincoln, but
very
so it's very
concise.
accessible,
Yes.
concise, and
Such
well,
an
you have
interesting
here are
read.
my notes.
You did your homework,
I did
Jim.
my
Whoa,
homework.
I'm
I don't know if we're going to
impressed.
be able to get to all these,
My
but I have to tell
gosh.
you, I'm a student of Abraham Lincoln. He's a hero of mine, and
Mine
I
too.
learned all kinds of new things about it as a result of this. Tell us, why did you write a
Wow.
book on Lincoln?
Well, Arthur Schlesinger was the editor-in-chief of this series, which includes all the presidents. And they're going to do a book on each one of the presidents, beginning with Washington, with a different author for each book. And I drew Lincoln, which I thought was a great piece of luck because I regard him as our greatest president. You're quite right about the large number of books about Lincoln already written. It's over 6,000.
Oh my gosh.
More than
Should we write one, Jim?
more than the combined total of all the other presidents. Lincoln.
Wow.
Anyway,
was
I
quite a
found it a
man.
fascinating book. They ask us to hold it to around each book to around 165 pages.
Great.
I did that, which meant that I had to cross out a lot of brilliant stuff that I had written that went beyond the 165 pages. So tearfully, I struck out that extra language, and I don't think I hurt the book any at all.
And many things I've never known before. You really bring out the fact that he was a great politician. When he was trying to
brilliant.
lobby for the 13th Amendment, he had to work hard at getting the votes, and he had to trade for votes. I remember reading in there that he had to give political patronage
Yes.
for trading for votes.
Today he might be put behind bars
Yeah,
if
it
he were
might
trying
be.
those things.
Well, Lincoln was a shrewd politician, or he never would have gotten to the White House with the odds being against him, as they were. 1 year of formal education, suffering from clinical depression, which he called melancholy. So he had to work hard, and that meant making political allies, which he did shrewdly. He started collecting supporters across the state of Illinois as a lawyer when he was out on the circuit. He kept the names of people and remembered who the key people were in different places. He was also a very clever debater. At one point, one of his opponents described him as two-faced. Lincoln said, "Does the gentleman really think that if God had given me two faces, I'd wear this homely one.
Oh my gosh, what a great response.
I like that kind of humor.
Yes.
It disarms your opponent,
Yes.
and yet, in a sense, it's kind of a show of humility. And so he was very good at the interior workings of politics, as well as being a great statesman with a vision for the country. But it doesn't do much good to have a vision for the country if you don't know how to harness that desire to constructive measures that'll get you elected to office. Lincoln was a good candidate.
Yes, and he was a very gentle soul inside, but I think he had to sort of make his exterior a lot harder.
That's correct.
To deal with the Civil War and
And
forge on like he did.
Yeah, and you speak of his vision, but what you bring out so well is that Lincoln's original vision was not eliminating slavery.
Yeah.
It was preservation of the Union. That
Right.
evolved and, of
Yeah.
course, was encapsulated so beautifully in the Gettysburg
It
Address.
was.
Yes.
Tell us about that,
Well,
that change in the vision and the evolution of that vision.
Lincoln said, if I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, that I would do. If I could save the Union by freeing some of the slaves and holding others, which is what the Emancipation Proclamation did, I would do that. But the Union must be preserved. He worked hard as a political figure to pacify the South. He didn't want 11 states to secede from the Union, so he kept assuring Southern political leaders that he wasn't going to disturb slavery where it existed. He, at the same time, told them no way would he permit slavery to come into the new territories, the new states that were coming into the Union. And the reason that was shrewd is that it had the sound, I think, to most reasonable people of being a sensible and common sense approach. He believed that if he could hold the line against the expansion of slavery into the new states coming into the Union, it would die out. They'd wear out the soil in the South with bad agricultural methods. They'd get tired of the labor problems, and that the way to get rid of slavery wasn't by the method of the abolitionist societies, which were the purists. I might have been an abolitionist in those days. You folks might have been abolitionists, but Lincoln saw that as something you couldn't sell in the South, or even in parts of the North. So he said, you know, I'm ready to compromise. And I think that showed his political skill. It also showed that he had this long-range vision of slavery dying out by preventing it from getting new reinforcements in the territory.
Incredible foresight and very shrewd. You draw a parallel between Abraham Lincoln and President Obama.
Well, you know, President Obama has said Lincoln is his role model. They both spent a lot of time in Springfield, Illinois. They both served in the state Senate for 4 or 5 terms. They both are articulate, highly intelligent men. I think there is some parallel between the two that's rather remarkable. Lincoln was skeptical of war. He fought the Civil War, but he opposed the Mexican War in his one term in Congress. Maybe that's why he had only 1 term. He came out against a popular war. I wish today that our President, Barack Obama, would not continue sending troops into Afghanistan. I think that's a no-win deal. I think he has the potential to be one of our greatest presidents. I want him to be a great president, but I wish he would show some of the care that Lincoln did in speaking out against wars that he thought were not entirely necessary.
Senator, we're out of time. I wish we can go on. I have all these questions I want to ask you about habeas corpus and Lincoln's speeches. But let me just recommend this to our
Great
viewing
read.
audience. It's a great read.
For all ages.
And it's really the
Yes.
kind of book that's very difficult to put down. Senator, it's been a privilege having you here.
Yes,
and
it has.
before we adjourn, I'd like to express my appreciation to Patricia Kelly, who is a guest here on Dialogue a year ago or so, the wife of Gene Kelly, but herself a social activist, a distinguished writer. And I want to thank her for helping bring you to Chapman University and having you with us this very, very special day.
Patricia Kelly is a wonderful woman. She loves people. She moves around better than I do.
She's amazing.
Meeting people and making them feel that they're part of the activity going on. So I'm very fortunate to have her as a manager on this tour promoting the Lincoln book.
And she's writing a book now on her departed husband, Gene Kelly, and I'm hoping that when that book is out, we'll have Patricia back on the show.
Great.
Senator,
Yes.
thank you for being on the
Senator.
show. An honor and privilege.
I love your college here. I greatly admire it.
Thank you.
Thank you.